what a lie from the pit of hell. These folks that are telling these children, oh, it's not going to hurt you long term. Really? It stunts your growth. You're looking at cardiovascular disease, cerebral vascular disease, infertility. These kids are being sold a lie. And I've heard the kids come back and tell this in committee meeting.
State Representative Robin Lundstrom of Arkansas is among those on the front lines of the transgender debate. Her frustration and resoluteness is palpable. And it's understandable because at the core of the transgender debate today is an affirmation-only model that leaves no room for questions, inquiry, rational discussion, or debate. As we've explored thus far, the implications of this diabolical approach have impacted our schools, medical institutions, and families. In this episode of Generation Indoctrination, we'll explore the perils of affirmation-only approaches and how the cultural implications are playing out on the legal and legislative fronts. As we move into this arena, let's begin by revisiting the perils of affirmation-only treatment approaches. I spoke with a therapist who has chosen to go by a pseudonym for fear of retribution. Her name is Carla. Here's her powerful explanation. Why is affirmation-only a tragic and dangerous approach to addressing those who experience gender confusion, particularly children? Why is this so dangerous, Carla?
So basically because it's solely based upon our feelings. And I don't know about you, but I know my own feelings change from time to time. And this is particularly true of young girls in middle school. Young people's feelings are all over the place. So think about the mind of the child for a moment. So imaginative, so confused, so stubborn, so malleable. Now consider what this particular generation has had drilled into them since childhood.
Carla went on to explain the dire assumptions at the base of affirmation-only approaches to gender, noting how each is based on a tragic misconception.
And there's three main constructs to this. Construct one is the idea that my personal happiness is the key to individual flourishing, or my personal happiness is living my best life, living abundantly, living to the fullest. So the goal is personal happiness. So think about that. In actuality, happiness is always fleeting. So this is severely flawed in thinking that I can be in a constant state of happiness, but this is the construct. So construct number two is that I am my personal feelings. I need to express feelings outwardly, what I am feeling inwardly. So for example, a child experiences anxiety when around new people, or talking to grown-ups, or talking on the phone. Like a decade or two ago, we used a moral vocabulary instead of a psychological vocabulary. In the past, parents would compel the child, who they saw as being rude, to practice speaking on the phone or ordering off a menu. But now, these same kids, these parents are labeling them as having social anxiety and excusing the same before-mentioned behavior. So that's construct two. Construct three is the idea that interfering with somebody else's happiness is very, very bad. And if you interfere or disagree with this ideology, you can be labeled as transphobe, someone who hates anyone not exactly like them, and canceled like so many other of the brilliant minds. This is the continuous push to affirm feelings no matter what they are. And let's be honest, feelings pass, especially in children.
Feelings do indeed pass, which is what makes the handling of the entirety of the trans debate, particularly when it comes to children, maddening. Unfortunately, we've started to see these emotions and the associated affirmation craze become codified into law, which is perhaps one of the most dangerous elements of the current crisis. And the federal government, under the Biden administration, has openly embraced child transitions, with the president calling upon parents to affirm children's self-perceptions. In fact, Biden said in a recent speech, quote, "To the parents of transgender children, affirming your child's identity is one of the most powerful things you can do to keep them safe and healthy," unquote. But while the government descends into madness, states and communities across the countries are fighting back. I spoke with Robin Lundstrom, an Arkansas state representative, about her action to curb gender madness. Representative Lundstrom, you have played a very instrumental role in this space because you were the lead sponsor of a bill in the state of Arkansas called the SAFE Act, the Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act, which is model legislation that other states are using, but your state was the first, and you were the first legislator to put your name on it, and you got the bill passed. Can you tell us how that started and what was it about this issue, the medicalization of gender, particularly in children, hormone blockers, cross-sex hormones, and cosmetic gender surgeries on minors? When did that first come to your attention, and what was your first reaction when you learned about what that was and how it was happening to a few people in your state?
Well, at first I was very surprised. I'm very thankful that the Republican legislature and actually the Republican women made this part of their Dream Big agenda for last session. And we actually got together and we're talking about different issues. And I brought up that this was starting to happen a lot on the West Coast and East Coast. And one of the other legislators said, it's actually happening here in Arkansas. And I thought, surely not. And the more we investigated, the more we realized it was happening here in Arkansas. And in order to get out ahead of this before hundreds and hundreds of kids were impacted, we thought we'd start. And little did we know how many kids just in Arkansas were experiencing this type of trauma and were impacted by, unfortunately, this type of woke agenda.
As Robin researched and explored the realities on the ground, she became increasingly troubled by what she claims to have found.
The more you research this issue, the more disheartening and the more concerned you become. And I actually had transgender adults come and talk to me and tell me the trauma that they've been through and how they wanted to see this not happen to children. Just hearing the amount of surgery, they make it sound so easy. Oh, you can just do top surgery or bottom surgery, or you can take gender affirming care. There's nothing gender affirming about this. It's actually cutting the breasts off a 13-year-old child or the penis off of a 17-year-old male. These kids don't even know what they're getting into, but you talk to transgender adults and they will tell you pretty quickly just how horrific this is. And they are very quick to tell you just how painful this whole process is. And so I was really appreciative of the fact that there are adults all over this country who have said, no, this should not happen to children.
When did it sort of hit you that you realized, okay, I'm a lawmaker, I'm an elected representative, I have to take action, I must put my name on a bill and go to bat for something like this because it's just so important? Can you tell us what it was that spurred you on to take this action?
Well, the thought process is the more you read about this issue, it's a lot like seeing a car accident. Do you not dial 911? What adult looks the other way when you know that this is happening to children in Arkansas? And you know, in every state, we set parameters for children under 18. You can't buy spray paint or cough syrup, but we would look the other way while they're cutting themselves. I don't think so. That would be the time to say something. Is back in 2020 when this whole started, we needed to say something. And waiting, maybe thinking it might go away. Now, then you become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So in my estimation, that was the time to act.
Representative Lundstrom rallied her colleagues to support the Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act, which went through both chambers and was vetoed by Governor Asa Hutchinson, a Republican. But Lundstrom didn't stop there. With 65 co-sponsors and momentum, the legislature overrode the veto, solidifying Arkansas as the first state to ban gender transitions for kids. A recent court ruling found the law unconstitutional, but the battle is sure to go on, and Lundstrom shared why it matters.
I think this is going to be a debate for a long time, and I think one of the reasons that people shy away from this issue, they don't want to be labeled, and I think we need to stand above the label and call it out and say, wait a second, these are children. Let's talk about the facts.
Jeremy Carl, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Interior under the Trump administration, is among those who have boldly addressed the crimes being committed against our children. He, too, takes issue with those who have repressed the facts and believes there should be consequences.
We could have an interesting discussion about how much of this was sort of coordinated in some sort of nefarious way versus just something in the cultural zeitgeist, or how we're training these people that kind of cause them to embrace this mania. I'd probably lean a little more toward the latter, because I'm not kind of tend to see conspiracies, maybe even sometimes when they're there. But regardless, you have this clear effort. And I think there need to be legal consequences for this, by the way. I think this is part of the next kind of element of this, is that the people who've done this to kids and I'm not even talking, because I think we need to be reasonable about what's accomplishable. I'm not talking about just somebody who participated in did a surgery, which was legal, even though we would all agree that it should be illegal. But for the people who were the principal ideologists of this, the people who repressed science actively, who I'm sure if you went through the records and subpoenaed them in a legal context, you would find that facts and science were completely sublimated to their ideology. And when that was done to abuse children, I think they need to suffer legal and criminal consequences. And I think ultimately that is a very significant part of where we need to go if we really match the outrage we say we have.
As we shared earlier in the series, Florida mom January Littlejohn has been locked in a legal battle with her school district after her daughter began to identify as a male and school officials allegedly shielded information from her and her husband. She shared the impact of that purported situation.
This is creating a huge wedge between parents and their children. And it certainly did that in my family. It was a year and a half of a nightmare I do not wish upon anybody. We are continuing to go through.
Littlejohn and her attorney, Bernadette Broyles, have been deeply supportive of Florida's Parental Rights in Education Act, a piece of legislation that LGBTQ critics have donned the Don't Say Gay bill. Broyles explained the benefits of that law, which was signed by Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. While not a punishment for past behavior, it's a parental protectorant.
90-something% of this bill was all about was requiring that schools provide to parents the very same kind of information that was being withheld from the Littlejohns, that they would be required to provide parents information about their child's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. They were to make it explicitly clear that they are not entitled to withhold such information from parents. Now, school officials should have already recognized that based on the Parents' Bill of Rights, but apparently they were still recalcitrant, and so they needed additional legislation to make it unmistakably clear. There was one sentence that forbid the teaching of sexual orientation and gender identity as part of curriculum in K through third grades. One sentence out of a 7-page bill. The opponents have seized on that one sentence to lose their minds now and claim that it's some sort of discriminatory intent. What's very telling about the opponents is that the fact that they would have chosen that one sentence that forbids instructing a young child that they can be born in the wrong body, it shows that their agenda really is about indoctrinating children in the ideology of gender identity. And so I think that they're really outing themselves in how they're over the top mischaracterizing this legislation. It's an appropriate piece of legislation to ensure parents have the critical information they need to watch over their children while they're in schools.
January, as a parent who has faced these issues head on, what was your response to the law?
I was happy to see steps being taken to further solidify and protect parental rights in our school system. I don't think this is going to be the end of what we see. And unfortunately, like Bernadette said, we shouldn't have even needed the Parent Bill of Rights or the Parental Rights in Education because we are already afforded the right to direct the upbringing of our children by both the U.S. and our state constitution. But it's really going to come down, Brandon, to parents holding the schools accountable when their rights are violated. And that's really been a call to action for me for a very long time now, because we have a lack of courage in this country. And we have got to stand up and hold schools accountable when they break the law. Because if we don't, they will continue to do it.
Jeremy Carl agrees, noting that the situation transcends partisan politics and requires people to step up to the plate to defend children falling prey to this dangerous ideology.
To me, this is an issue that transcends partisanship or partisanism, to the point, if I could fix this or play a role in fixing this while scoring 0 political points, I would do that in a second, rather than kind of just use it as a political cudgel, as much as it should be used, because it is, anybody who supports this politically, I think is really committing a terrible crime. I'd rather get 0 political points about it and stop the kind of abomination that we're doing to our kids, rather than get a bunch of political gains, but kids are still getting hurt by this. Even a lot of folks on the left are going to agree with us that these are bad. And I think that I'm happy to go build a coalition with anybody who's willing to do this. I really do think we can get some consensus on. We need to push for things that I don't think yet have a consensus, but I think we can build one.
Parents today are facing monumental challenges. In a case where policy and legal protections haven't been put in place, it's open season on the trans issue. I asked Jeremy Carl about the biggest barriers he believes parents today are facing.
I think one of the big dangers right now is that with a combination of not knowing what's going on always online, but at a second level, the fact that a lot of schools are within what they perceive to be their legal rights, they are kind of facilitating social and other types of transition at school without even alerting the parents. So I think that's a real danger. And again, unless you have legal prohibition, I think that's the problem. But you've got entire networks of people who feel they're empowered and feel they're empowered to act in the place of parents in a way that they really aren't. And so again, I think that's almost a societal change that we need to make in terms of teachers and school administrators understanding that their role is ultimately subordinate to that of parents in terms of a child's welfare.
Jeremy emphasized the importance, even before policy, of education and the targeting of social transitioning that often starts well before doctors come into the picture.
I think we need to push it by just getting the facts out there. Social transition in school, because social transition is the gateway drug that takes you there. And you give a kid who may be very confused, and I don't dispute, by the way, that these kids are suffering and they are confused about their identity, as many kids are, even at young ages. But when you allow them to socially transition at school for a couple of years, it kind of begins to put more and more pressure over time to kind of go down the medical path eventually. And so I think we just need to have a zero tolerance on this anywhere that we can affect that sort of change. And I think that would be sort of where I'd go. But I'd first obviously start with areas where we can develop a transpartisan consensus and then try to educate people about why we need to go, even further than that to really keep our kids safe.
With many remaining either ill-informed or silent about the tragic circumstances befalling our children, Robin Lundstrom wonders what child victims will one day say about the adults who remained mute while such horrors unfolded.
I think how deep this goes and how insidious and how truly cruel this is to children, and how the long-term impact, we are going to see the impact of this on these kids. And one of these days, these kids are going to turn around and they're going to wonder where the adults were when all this was happening. And they're going to look back at the adults in their lives and wonder, why didn't you say no?
Representative Lundstrom also offered some advice for legislators who are horrified by the situation before us and are looking to do something about it.
I would encourage them to run the bill. And second, you have to look at the women's sports bill. That's being run in a number of states. I think it's up to 28 or 30 states now that have run the women's sports bill, and it has passed. And the rights of conscience bill has passed. We're making headway, and it's because we're running common sense, good legislation. The SAFE Act is good legislation. It's an informed consent. Wait until the child is old enough to participate in their health care. What's the rush? What's the harm? The common sense is really where we need to hang our hats, so to speak. And running that bill, it may take once, it may take twice, but it does make a difference. And the women's sports bill in a couple of states been run a couple of times, and it's now in law. So we can't be discouraged. We need to be strong. We need to be courageous.
But the policies extend well beyond the legislative chambers.
We don't need indoctrination. When you see your child's homework, pay attention. Demand excellence. We're the customer. We need to demand that the quality of our education meet our standards. And school board elections, run good candidates. If you can't find a good candidate, you run. Those school board elections are pretty important. And we need to demand our school boards answer to us as the parents. We are the taxpayers, and we seem to forget that. And that's not something we need to forget. That's something we need to demand excellence.
And as Jeremy noted, a failure to take action and make such demands won't just leave victims questioning our silence. It will also leave them potentially maimed and harmed for the remainder of their lives.
I don't think you even have to have a theistic perspective to kind of understand some of the dangers of saying, like, well, the mind and the body are in some ways not connected. One could imagine that if this social contagion is not met really, really forcefully, you're going to have hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions over time of kids falling prey to this in various forms or fashion. I mean, thankfully, probably most of those, if you start talking about numbers that big, are not going to get surgery, but a lot of them may be getting drugs. They're going to suffer through the incredible social difficulties of having a social transition and then maybe waking up. This is like a best case scenario, and having to move back from that with all the confusion that can cause as an adolescent, maybe while all that's going on. So you're talking about really messing up potentially millions of young people for life in, various ways, from the kind of mildly horrific to the completely horrific. So I think that's the real stakes that we're playing for. And when you understand that you're playing for those stakes, the kind of notion that somebody's going to say something mean about you on Twitter or in the newspaper kind of pales in comparison.
Changing policy begins by speaking up and educating others. These elements are deeply intertwined, with silence preventing legal protections from ever taking form. At the end of the day, Attorney Bernadette Broyles delivered a stirring and convicting call to action.
Here's the final thing. Someone wisely told me several months ago, Bernadette, whoever wants these children the most will have them. In the last number of years, gender ideological activists have wanted these children badly because they recognize that children are they're suggestionable. They lack the life experience to recognize when something is false and they're being manipulated. But I believe parents want their child more, and the more that they recognize that this is at the door, we need to communicate to school officials, they belong to us, we want them more, and you cannot have them.
Stay tuned next week for the final episode of Generation Indoctrination.